John, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Mike, thank you very much for having me. I'm always glad to be back in Pensacola. Thank you very much for coming in such an amazing number. And thank you very much for the wonderful venue. As John mentioned, we have written a book together. I figured writing in English, I need a little bit of help. Thank you, John. The book describes my time in Russia and the aftermath. I come out of a German family business, and I specialized in providing special operations equipment around the world and some training for that. And the opportunity came up when I was working on a project in Saudi Arabia with Commander Ulrich Wegener from the GSG-9. And I had a chance to go to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg in Russia, and I saw a tremendous market opportunity. The wall was coming down later that year, in 1989, as you know, and I did a joint venture with the police department. And the reason I chose the police department as a business partner was the fact that I thought, you know, these people at least are not corrupt and they're not criminals. Wrong I was. About 7 months into my investment, I was told by the deputy police chief, thank you very much for your contribution. I think your flight will be leaving in about 2 or 3 days. So thank you very much. Don't come back. I didn't take that laying down and ended up having a conversation with Mr. Vladimir Putin, who was then the head of the foreign commercial department of the city of St. Petersburg. So I went in there to basically ask for assistance in resolving the matter at hand. Mr. Putin looked at me, he shook my hand. He's not a very tall man. He was very serious. He never smiled. He let me finish what I had to tell him. The only exception was he only raised his hand once when I had a translator translate for me, and he said, we can do this conversation in German because I speak German. And so we finished it in German. After I got done with my complaints and my request for help, he told me, you know what, I'm not going to touch this with a long stick. I'm not getting involved. So I got up, I left, shook his hand, and said, you know what, I will be back. I started doing homework, and I found out the problem Mr. Putin, the problem why Mr. Putin was not helping, because that was counterproductive for him. To choose a conflict with the local executive organs of state, that is the police, tax police, and others, simply because his sole mission was to be of assistance to the mayor. His name was Anatoly Sobchak. He was the first democratically elected mayor in Leningrad. And this mayor, unfortunately, was on the take. And Mr. Putin's sole job was to protect him from the law, literally speaking. Mr. Putin was a fixer. That was his mission. And having said that, I looked into Mr. Putin's past a little better. I found out, of course, he was in the KGB at one time. But unlike popular belief, Mr. Putin was never an operative person. He never was a shooter. He never was a spy. His sole mission at the time was he was a recruiter. He was recruiting assets. And not just assets from the street, but also assets from friendly services, for example, from the Stasi, from the East German intelligence community, etc. And when he came back from East Germany, from his first and last foreign assignment, the Soviet Union was just about to fall apart. He joined his future boss, the mayor, who was a professor of law at the Leningrad University. And from then, they went on. They won the first democratic elections. Mr. Sobchak became mayor. Mr. Putin was promoted to take care of external relations for commerce, and also he was registering all foreign companies that came to do business. There was a law on those companies, which was called the joint venture law, that meant that foreigners could not invest money 100% and take control of their investment. No, they had to have a local Soviet or Russian partner, who until then had to have at least 50%. When Mr. Putin, when Mr. Putin supported Mr. Sobchak. Word got out that there's two things. Number one, Mr. Putin, he's not on the take, he's not corrupt himself. And number two, he's very loyal to whoever he works for. They qualified him in 1996 for being picked by the Yeltsin family. First to come into the Upravlenie Delami Presidenta, which was the holding of all state assets controlled by the President of the Russian Federation. This organization dates back to the days of the Russian Revolution. This organization accumulated the wealth that was taken in the revolution from all families that had assets, industrial assets, commercial assets of any type. When the Soviet Union fell apart, that organization was the first thing Mr. Yeltsin confiscated. It was actually managed by the Communist Party, and then he got it under the presidential administration of the Russian Federation. At the end of the day, Mr. Putin ended up becoming KGB chief, the so-called FSB, which was renamed since the KGB days at least 5 times. He then went on to become the Prime Minister of Russia, started another second campaign in Chechnya, was on the front line the whole time, built an image as a very strong person, then went on to become designated President of the Russian Federation in December of 1999, and then won the popular elections in the year 2000. And as we all know, he has been in power ever since, just changed one time for 4 years to become the Prime Minister in order to get back. Mr. Putin has kept everybody rather busy in the last years. I have a friend, his name is Andrei Illarionov. He was his chief economic advisor until 2005. That is the year they decided to take Yukos, the oil company, away. And Mr. Illarionov resigned. He now is a member of the Cato Institute, responsible for the former Soviet Union and for the Eastern Bloc. He said in 2005, Putin destroyed the justice system. He raped human rights. He strangled the press, and he liquidated democracy. This is 2005. Now we are 2019, and only since some 3-4 years, everybody's waking up to the fact that we are facing a very aggressive Russia. A Russia which all of a sudden starts mingling in other countries, starts exporting instability to any and all possible locations you could think of. I don't care if it's connected to Brexit, Britain leaving Europe, the European community, whether it's to support the independence of Catalonia, whether it is to get involved in Syria, Libya, many other places. Our problem is that we are a little bit behind whatever he does. We are not active to avoid it. We are not reacting the way we should. People intend to talk more than to keep him at bay. Unfortunately, that just emboldens Mr. Putin. What are Mr. Putin's problems? Mr. Putin's problem is only one thing. He has discovered from his Sobchak days that in order to stay in power, you divide and you rule, much like a feudal system. The president giveth, the president taketh. He giveth for support, and he taketh as soon as there is opposition arising. So corruption is part of the system of ruling Russia today. There is no system that would protect anybody in Russia today. Everybody is on the take. I don't care if you're a poor person driving a car down the road, being stopped by a traffic policeman, he wants his share, or if you're an oligarch and Mr. Putin set his mind on getting a hold of Fabergé eggs, which are trading outside. So you better be ready to pay for those to be handed over to him. We have a problem in recognizing that Russia is the first case in history where we have a structure that is organized like an organized crime family, sitting in a government of a country that covers, with 180 million people, 11% of the land mass of the world. A country which cannot feed its people. They have to import food, over 40%, to be able to feed their people. They were not able, in 25 years, to create any type of a commercial industry that we would know in Europe and the United States. That means that 4/5 of all their exports are oil, gas, rare earth elements, metals, and the like. It's resources, unfinished product, raw materials. Only 1/5 is finished product. And it is amazing that out of that export volume, 50% goes back into military capability. 50% of that. On the other hand side, here's a couple of interesting numbers, I think. We have the United States as a comparison in economics. Your gross domestic product is 14 times larger than Russia's. Your purchase power is 5 times larger. Your military spending is 9 times larger. The corruption index of Russia is number 138 out of 175. Take that number for the United States, it's number 22. That shows you we are living in totally different worlds. And that is why it's hard for us to strike up any meaningful communication with someone who is not willing to commit. They're willing to talk, but they're not willing to commit to engage. They're not interested in the rule of law. They only see the West, that is the United States and Europe predominantly, as a port, as a safe haven for stolen assets. The money that is siphoned off in Russia today ends up in our economies. It's being invested here. And the reason they invested here, they're afraid they might lose their investment at home one day. Somebody new might come along and just take it away. So they're using our rule of law to protect their stolen assets. What a wonderful idea, is it not? So our problem right now is I have a friend, his name is Hans-Georg Maaßen. He used to be the head of the Internal Intelligence Service of Germany. He very much represents the German establishment. And in his words, the German government, and he as a person, as a professional, is eyeing Mr. Putin as a person acting in the national interest of Russia. My position is he's acting in the interest of someone who is clinging on to power because that's where he controls money. Money commands power in Russia. A national interest is only comfortable for him as long as it helps to keep on going with the corruption and feeding himself and his friends. Anyway, that's all I had on Mr. Putin. Question, please.
Let me get the microphone.
Sure.
Anybody have any questions to keep the dialogue running here? I mean, I could start it because I know a question on the top of my head here. Here you go.
Franz, talk about your land that you acquired, about the island that you owned, and about how you got tangled up with Mr. Putin and you sued him and you won the case. I'm waiting for that one.
Right, okay. In 1996, Mr. Yeltsin came to visit our island, which was called Kameny Ostrov, the Stone Island, which is probably around 10 minutes drive from Nevsky Prospect from the main hall. That island is made up of maybe 35 different dachas, larger residences. For example, the dacha of the Navy was there, the dacha of the mayor was there, and we operated in the dacha that was used by the police department. That's where our joint venture was registered. And one of my neighbors, who was the station chief of Scandinavian Airways, called me and says, you never guess who came to visit. I said, I don't know. And they were very much interested in your facility. They looked out the window and said, what a wonderful facility. I said, who came? He says, well, President Yeltsin and Mr. Putin. I said, okay. Then a short while later, I got a phone call from Mr. Putin insisting I have to come in for a talk, which I did. So I was faced with half the city government, and I was told that our location, our piece of real estate, which was whatever, 10,000 square meters with a little lake, 3 houses on top, housing was our residence, was our offices, was our storage facilities, etc. It was a complete compound. And we were nationalized. So my reaction was, okay, that's not exactly the news I wanted to hear, but it's no problem as long as we can get a substitute and we will be paid our leasehold improvements. So Mr. Putin and I sat down, we drafted a letter for the Upravlение Delami Presidenta, the presidential management of affairs that handle all commercial questions. And we basically said we need a substitute. The city would provide us with a new piece of real estate, and they would have to pay us for the leasehold improvements, something around $900,000. So a week later, we got an answer. This company was established illegally. No compensation will be forthcoming. End of story. So they thought they nationalized the U.S. company. The USA and Russia didn't have a bilateral investment treaty, which normally would hold an arbitration clause in the event of nationalization that an investor could go and file a rightful claim in a private court called arbitration court. But since I was a German citizen, I was able as a shareholder, or as the only shareholder, to invoke the German bilateral investment treaty. So we took them to Stockholm to arbitration, and we literally took them to the cleaners. And 2 years later, we had a sizable amount of money in the form of an award. Of course, not cash, just like a judgment, a piece of paper. And I figured, now they really have to pay because they would have some face to lose if they wouldn't, and that probably would endanger their reputation, as goes for other investors who might come into Russia. You know what? They did not care. So it took me like 15 years to get even with them. Now everything is paid up. We ended up selling 9 pieces of land that belonged to their trade missions in Cologne, Germany, and in Stockholm, Sweden. And they had this little habit that they weakened their own immunity from execution, from enforcement, by renting that stuff out commercially, which meant they forfeited the immunity. And that is the case law that we had created in doing our case. So it took a while, but we got paid.
Franz, you mentioned earlier, based on your knowledge of what Mr. Putin's net worth is.
Well, Mr. Putin has nothing in his own name. Whatever is being put aside for him, it's being put aside by friends, and it's probably also being invested in some of their so-called state banks and state companies. The problem Mr. Putin has, the moment he steps down, he's losing complete control. So his mission in life is to hang on to power. I just had John Huntsman wrote something in the Wall Street Journal, which I read. I gave Mr. Huntsman my book before he went to Russia to make sure he's ready. And he came back with something in the Wall Street Journal that said, Putin's days are numbered. Putin's days are numbered. I'm not convinced they are numbered, because Mr. Putin, as is Russian custom, the man in power, the Nachalnik, is controlling everything. The day, the minute, the second he leaves power, he's reduced to nothing. And Mr. Putin knows that very well, so I'm sure that we'll have Mr. Putin around for the next 10 to 15 years, easy, health permitting. Oh, since he divorced his first wife, I'm afraid not.
Hey, Franz, tell us what you're doing now, and where do you live now, and what is your current business?
My current business to sell books, so you better go buy books, my God. Thank you very much, Jerry. No, I also run an asset recovery company. We take care of distressed debt in the forms of arbitration awards and judgments. Usually they're issued in other countries, and they're issued against people and organizations and also states not willing to pay up. So that's what I specialize in. I learned my lesson, and now I can have something to give back.
Where do you live now?
I live in Spotsylvania, in Virginia, in the middle of nowhere, and we absolutely love it, on a little lake, in a little house, and I'm up in DC maybe once a week or twice a month or so, and it's absolutely fabulous. We moved out here from Munich, Germany last August, together with my wife and my daughter. My daughter will finish high school this year. My son is going to law school in Vienna in Austria.
Franz, thanks. You described a picture of financial exploitation by people who are corrupt against our system that we fought and defended and built through good working relationships where honesty is the policy that gets us forward. And all these crooks over in Russia with the Putin family are coming over here and exploiting our system in the West. Can you explain some of the psychology behind us as being welcoming to money that we are not sure about? I specifically look at London's financial district. They've been taking dark money a long time and putting it into the system. In Germany, several big banks, including one that's in the news these days, is very much in the center of money laundering allegations, and we need to peel that back. And it's in our country as well, with the real estate market in New York City and Miami being targeted as a place to put money in and let it get into the economy, and our workers are being exploited. Just what's the psychology, and what's the correction that we need to do?
The correction we need to do, I mean, the English have passed a law. It's called the Unexplained Wealth Law. It's something which actually was first written by the Italians with their mafia. They basically said, "Oh, you have a house? Okay, now let me ask you, how did you pay for it? Where did the money come from?" So, in other words, the burden of proof is now on the party that is in possession or has the ownership of that house. I think that's a very smart thing to do. I mean, I remember when I paid for my house in Spotsylvania, it took me 3 weeks to get the money from Germany to my bank account here in the United States, and I had to fill out paperwork, and I had to show them where the money came from. So I think if that would be the mandatory rule for everything, then money laundering would be made a lot harder. Now, we have a international tax assistant treaty, which everybody signed on to, including the United States, of course. And that treaty is very interesting because it asks all the right questions. And there is something which is interesting. There is one question that says, are you declaring taxes in your domicile where you're registered as a company or as a private individual? And when you check that box, the bank doesn't have to forward any more paperwork to verify. So we have this wonderful tax instrument, but actually it has a gaping hole that everybody's marching through. As far as actual money laundering is concerned, I mean, the Deutsche Bank is probably the bank you're referring to. They have started doing money laundering through their Moscow office, which was predominantly staffed by Russians, not necessarily Germans. The moment they came out, they shifted it. It then became, they opened up a new connection between Estonia, a branch of Danske Bank, which is a Danish bank, and instead of laundering 70 billion, they laundered nearly 300 billion. And then the Deutsche Bank, which initiated the first time, was the secondary bank that received the money through Danske Bank. So you see, they're not learning. They just keep on doing what they're doing because they know as long as nobody is going to prison, this system is going to continue.
Got a question?
Sure.
Did you ever fear for your personal safety? People get poisoned, people disappear. Did you work?
You know the old joke? Sorry. If I ever was afraid for my life because people get poisoned, stabbed, shot, etc., the answer is not anymore. Initially I did, but I also realized I had to sleep at night, so I gave that up. Deal with it when it comes to. which is, by the way, there's a little joke line out there. It said, in Russia, president assassinates you. Yes, sir.
We noticed recently that the Chinese Communist government is starting to again feel the threat with religion and religious beliefs.
Right.
And they're suppressing it. It amazes me that Putin isn't feeling the same thing, because under communism they suppress the competition, which is religious freedom. What is he doing about that? And is he facing a threat from religious belief?
Well, Putin aligned himself with the Russian Orthodox Church. In order to understand that, it's not just that he gets more support for what he's doing from the population doing that, but the Orthodox Church in the days of communism was made up largely by KGB informants and by officers of the KGB, believe it or not. So there's a traditional relationship there, that it's not far-fetched for them to collaborate. Anything outside the Orthodox Church, be it Lutheran Church, Catholic Church, and other more or less more dominant churches, they will try everything to make their life hard. But when it comes to, for example, the Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints, and when it comes to the Jehovah's Witnesses, they went as far as to lock people up for extremism. And don't forget, Russia has a law on blasphemy, which is used on their political opponents. So there's people going to jail for something we got rid of hundreds of years ago, which is absolutely crazy. I mean, from my own guard force, 2/3 of my guard force were Russian Orthodox. One-third of my guard force were Jehovah's Witnesses, which was quite interesting for me. So there's a community, there's an understanding of people of the same faith in Russia, absolutely.
Can you assure us that you've had no contact with the Clintons that might lead you to commit suicide? You gotta repeat that question.
If I had any contact with the Clintons, I can tell you that my CPA, Mike Johnson from Little Rock, Arkansas, at one time was an associate of Hillary. And I did have lunch at the Pleasant Country Club in Little Rock, where the Clintons never were allowed to enter. That's the two things that connect me there.
Please tell us about the impact of social media and the internet in Russia, and are the young people satisfied to keep this kind of system of corruption and evil going on?
Absolutely. There's two sides to social media. There's the one side where we can see the Russians and also the Chinese, not just the Russians, Chinese, that's a big deal too these days. They're funding companies, individuals, to preach hate, to influence political movements, to create havoc. I mean, give you one example. We had a mass shooting in Munich. A young man of Iranian descent, born and raised in Germany, picks up a pistol, a Glock 17, and he shoots 10 people that he believes are foreigners, predominantly Turks and Greeks, in a shopping center, just kills them. RT, Russia Today, which some of you might know, takes that, and while the police is going to the scene of this mass shooting, which is a shopping center in the north of Munich, and says there's other mass shootings going on all around the city of Munich, spreading complete chaos in the city. People don't know where to go, so the police decide they have to check that out. It seems like it's first-hand credible information that's coming in through Twitter. RT is using Twitter to spread these messages. As a matter of fact, there were no other scenes of any shooting anywhere else in the city, but they used the opportunity to destabilize the whole situation. It ended up in the German police cutting all traffic in and out of the city. They stopped all cars, all trains, anything that moved. There were people, literally, there was the good news, opening their apartments so people could sleep for one night because they couldn't get home anymore. But it really had an impact. For the first time in Germany, people understood what's going on. But imagine Catalonia, Spain, unrest, when you have literally money being pushed into social media to stir up the mix, to bring people out into the street, to bring people to riot and to burn and to loot. And these are all practical effects of this. On the other hand side, it has some good side to it too. Mr. Putin has been getting very nervous for the last years with the demonstrations. Young people, for the first time 3-4 years ago, young people as young as 12 turn out to demonstrate against Putin and his Kremlin guys in the streets in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in many of the cities. And the reason they do that is because they're on social media. They are not the generation that now reads newspapers, watches state-controlled television, state-controlled radio. They get their stuff unfiltered through Twitter, through Facebook, etc. So this is a big deal. The Russians now are trying to cut off the internet in Russia from the outside world in order to control it, much like the Chinese have been trying to do. So we are looking at the communication channels. It's sort of, they're going to have their own little iron curtain going down electronically pretty soon.
Anybody else? Thank you, Franz.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.